Cool. So, that's the wrong share button. Present. All right. So, hello everyone. I'm Richard Liu. I'm a senior, rising senior at Little Rock Central High, and this is my lecture on how to write a planless affirmative. So, before this, I wanted to go over the playlist I was listening to while making this presentation. So, I listened to The Big Day by Chance, Graduation by Kanye, and a few Nicki songs. I believe that the vibrational frequencies when sort of doing critical debate is incredibly important. And I also included a link to Sri Alsari from North Broward's lecture on how to write a planless app as well, since this is a really helpful lecture that sort of goes over what I'm about to say sort of a bit more in depth, and it uses a few examples from his own experience as a coach for North Broward, which is a very successful team. So it's definitely worth a watch if you have some time. So why do people write planless apps? There are three main reasons. The first is strategy. So people are usually pretty bad at answering planless apps. They can only come up with the CapK and TUSFG. Some teams, they might read Psycho, but other than that, most next strats are terrible. Like Blink, if you think about pick is bad. Second, teams write planless apps to sort of dodge clash. It's very easy to say like not our X when you're reading a critical affirmative, since the theories are usually pretty broad. One author might write multiple books on different subjects or the same subject. There's no like necessarily objective take on any critical theory, mainly just sort of subjective takes. And if you get really deep into lit base, you can understand the arguments better than any negative team will be able to understand them, which allows you to recontextualize and skirt any offense or insights they actually do read. Third is that teams sometimes find a theory that's really interesting and they want to read that argument. This is actually, in my opinion, the most important factor. You sound more persuasive when you're persuaded. And I do believe that reading critical arguments does impact subjectivity, or at least the ways that you think about common things. Since if you literally never read about like anti-blackness, about the violence of the state, you oftentimes, wouldn't be compelled to believe those are true. And I do think that teams that read critical arguments just for the strategic benefits usually aren't as successful as teams who actually believe what they're talking about. So I do encourage you to sort of read critical theory and try to be impacted by it instead of just doing it for strategy. But let's talk about how to actually write plans out. So first, there are two different methods, right? The first method is that you start with a familiar theory and think about its relationship to the curriculum surrounding the topic. So let's say you're interested in settler colonialism. So you should first start with some Google Scholar searches of it linked to the topic, i.e. settler colonialism and water resources and colonialism, water colonialism, etc. And you want to learn about the subject and how it interacts with traditional arguments against said subject. So for example, how does it interact with water protection good, state engagement good, framework, obviously. And then you can also download some files from open evidence that perhaps Wake or Michigan has put out about settler colonialism. You can read those cards. Most of them are going to be neg files, but you sort of just want to understand the literature base before you start cutting. One big con of this strategy is that you might not reach the best articles on this topic, and it can be difficult to see the most strategic arguments at first glance, since you're doing such a sort of broad general search at the very beginning. For example, North Broward MR's signifying app on the education topic was really strategic and really successful, but although it discussed anti-blackness, it wasn't just like an Afro-pessimism critique of education policy. Instead, it was a specific argument about how sort of Black people should be able to use ebonics in educational spaces, that they didn't contextualize the debate and made it really strategic. There wouldn't have been a way to just find like the signifying solvency advocate just by searching anti-Blackness in education. But it's also good to have like a sort of broader understanding of the arguments that you're trying to make before you start looking for those very strategic specific strategies when cutting planets off. So I would recommend doing this first strategy first, and then using the second strategy I'm about to get to second. The second strategy is instead of starting with a 1AC or starting with a theory, you should start with the 2AC when you're cutting an argument. So like you want to ask yourself, what are the 2AC arguments I'd like to make against framework? How am I going to beat the TVA and switch side debate are two good framing tricks that you should use when cutting an F. Because if you can't answer those two questions, like with your affirmative, you're probably going to lose debates because judges really like being able to make the framework flow really simple, really easy. They don't like having to like compare impacts, doing like the nitty gritty work on the flow. So if like the judge thinks, oh, switch side debate solves AF offense, TVA solves AF offense, that means I can just vote on a procedural impact, they will do that. So you want an AF that can really like defeat switch side debate and TVA really well. And in order to do that, you'll have to ask yourself a few questions I'm going to get to later in the presentation. So when I say like 2AC to start, like the 2AC that I want to make against framework, this can be team and argument specific. So if you know like a team in your area only goes for procedural fairness, you might want to cut a more identity-based staff and less like postmodernism. Or if you know that a team is like really good at beating the counter interpretation, but they're not so good at doing the impact debate, you might want to cut AF that's less middle of the road and much more sort of that just impact turns everything. For example, last year I read a set call F at one tournament, which was MBA, but it was completely different from what I was reading the first semester, which was an Asian identity F. And more importantly, it was not at all attempted to debate the counterinterp, which my F the first semester was. I was hitting Shamanad AH round 5. So if you know that team, they were really, really good. They made the finals of the TOC last year. And I had actually debated them sophomore year, where they absolutely destroyed me on the counterinterp debate. They just embarrassed me on the framework flow. And I noticed that they went for Clash this year. So the set call F that I had was really tailored to beat Clash, since it took a stance that was just like we should sort of only have debates about settler colonialism and CJR. Any other debate is not productive. We should sort of put discussions of like policy reform on time out and instead discuss like this sort of ways that research forms exclusion in debate. So the 2NR in that debate, like, goes for like Clash goes for we internal link to their offense, but they sort of drop some of our broader theory claims about settler colonialism, ontology, and the types of debates we should be having. So the 2AR was able to exploit that weakness because our 2AC was tailored to beat that strategy. So that's like a sort of example of how you should prepare your planless off starting from the 2AC, not the 1AC. With that being said, here are some like things that you should not do. The first is that you should not read a KF that is just a state bad argument. So you can't take a neg file and put it on the AF because it will always lose the switch side debate. Teams are also really prepared to debate water protection good this year, and they'll sort of like be able to like read their AF as a counter plan against you if your interpretation is like we should never have debates over water protection. Like they'll be ready to impact her in the 1AC, especially since this like saying water protection good isn't necessarily like as bad as saying like arm sales good was 2 years ago. Um, Instead, your AF should sort of have an argument about why debating about and switching sides on the curriculum of water protection is bad. So it can't be a card that says water protection is bad, it's racist, it's anti-black, but instead it should be a card that says we should not be switching sides over questions of anti-blackness and water, or like the process of having debates over water protection are bad because they train us to adopt a technocratic approach. The life, the water, it trains us to sort of see water as resource, etc. If we're going to take a more postmodern or Heideggerian cybernetic approach, and you should have arguments that are like we should not even have debates where pest needs to debate against water protection good, CJR good, immigration good, arms sales good, etc. So you don't just want a state bad argument. That will lose to like a lot of really simple negative arguments, but if you have arguments about the process of debate being bad, then that gets you a lot more. Second, I do not think that you should just read something just because you think it's strategic. I think that at least one of the speakers has to genuinely care and believe the stuff that you're debating about. A lot of times, if you don't understand the arguments you're making, or if you don't really take the time to get really deep into the lit base because you're passionate about it, you simply won't be able to explain it at a level where you can like sort of out debate the neg at every turn, which means that it's often more strategic if you like genuinely don't believe case, like if you don't believe in the theories you're talking about, to just get good at what you like maybe you like policy debate, maybe you like Spark or something. Just sort of you should try to care about and learn about the theories that you're talking about, since these are often really serious, really potent and important discussions that these debates produce. So that's just something to keep in mind. Let's have a quick discussion on counter interpretations, which is a big part of when you're cutting your 1AC. After all, the 1AC you cut should be included within your model of debate. And a lot of times the 1AC determines what types of counterinterps you read. So in my opinion, counterinterps are underrated on framework, but judges seem to care less about them nowadays. For example, at NDCA, in my doubles round, two of the judges that voted for me told me that we lost the counterinterp debate, which I spent like 2 minutes of the 2AR on. So I was like, wow, that sucks. Why did you vote for me? And then they were like, but you just completely won the impact debate. And you could have made this ballot even simpler if you had just gone all in on like the impact turn and the disadvantage framework. And I was like, oh, okay, that's something I'll keep in mind. With that being said, there are three main different counterinterps in debate, and you should actually be using these sort of interchangeably with the judge that you have in question. So let's just go through them really quick. The first is a counterinterp that does not counterinterp the words of the resolution, but rather the role of the affirmative. For example, we should not be having debates over like USFG water protection, but this debate should be sort of having the discussion of X thing, maybe settler colonialism, maybe logistics, maybe Asian identity, or etc. Like these counterinterps usually are more for giving the AF a way to solve their offense rather than trying to solve any of the neg's offense. For example, the neg argument in response to this counterinterp is usually just like no words makes it infinitely arbitrary, no definitions, it's not predictable, it is unlimited, and the app isn't really trying to read this counterinterp to say that's the most predictable model, but rather saying that it's the best model because it allows more discussions of X thing that is most important, which allows the app to sort of solve their offense and have some ground level defense, like to stop the neg from saying that their model of the resolution is completely unlimited, like whatsoever. Like this counterinterp is pretty popular nowadays with, since a lot of teams are realizing that it's more strategic to impact turn and just beat the neg on offense rather than trying to win on defense. But yeah, so that's the first counterterp. The second sort of counterterp that teams read is a critique of language and procedure. So it's an argument that certain debaters should not be forced to participate in like procedure and language because it's not understood the same way by every person. For example, expert legal jurisprudential definitions should not be the locus of predictability. We should instead adopt definitions from a different source. So maybe that's like a T3 tier argument. Maybe it's in a different language through a code switching argument. But these definitions, I mean, this counterinterp can be really strategic if done properly, since it allows you to access some of those procedural fairness limits, clash impacts by making structural fairness arguments, while still also allowing you to make offensive arguments, like the same impact turns that the first counterinterp makes. The problem is just that the second interp can be somewhat difficult to pull off just because the arguments that can make these counterinterps is somewhat niche, somewhat specific. Teams like North Star did it really well. We tried to do the few rounds with our Asian identity AF last year, but it can be really strategic. But I'd usually stick the 1 and 3, just because those are sort of easier to do. The third interp is that you should just debate framework like it's T, i.e. USFG is we the people, water protection is broader. Like you sort of concede that debates over water protection are good, but that they should not always be over top-down policy reform to the USFG. They shouldn't always just be like the privatization counter plan, the infradisad versus like a hard right nuclear impact. Instead, like this counter makes arguments about why maybe grassroots movements debates are good, or why maybe sort of like different for example, abolition on the CJR topic last year would have been really similar to this third interp. So this interp gives you a lot of defense to framework, but it also sort of limits out the offense you can make. For example, a lot of the exclusion offense, respectability politics offense, uh, like stasis offense, all of that probably links to you if you're going to read the third interp. So these are all things to keep in mind if you're going to cut an AF. For example, if you're going to cut an AF that's like Afropest based, sort of like Warren Witherson, you probably don't want to be reading the third counter interp. You probably want to read the first counter interp. On the other hand, if you're going to read like an abolition AF, it may be more strategic to lean into what you're saying. Like if you're going to say that like sort of movements reform is good, then you should probably read the third interp because it grants you the defense. Like you should do what's most strategic to the affirmative that you're reading, but you should also be ready to debate all three of these interps because some judges will be like, if you don't counter define words in the resolution, you will lose. Like for example, I think Shri has this in his paradigm. Other judges, on the other hand, will be like, I literally only want to see you impact certain things. Do not read definitions. Like you're not going to win that debate. So you should be prepared to debate all three of these sort of strategies. Before I like go into different examples of how I cut affirmatives, I also wanted to talk about the cap K really quick. I don't think that 2A's should be losing to the cap K ever. And this is not because the cap K is a bad argument, but rather because the way that it interacts in strategy against KFs often favors 2A's, in my opinion. The first reason is that the 2 and R that grudgingly, there are two types of cap Ks, right? The first is like the 2 and R just grudgingly extends the 1 and R, like didn't want to go for cap, but kicks framework because the F spent 30 seconds on the K and the 1AR. The problem is that these 2 and Rs are usually pretty shallow because the 2N is used to going for procedural fairness, not like the value of an international Marxist revolution. And the 1 and R, isn't given 8 minutes to answer the case. So if the 2A spent a lot of time there in the 2AC, the 1 and R is kind of screwed. If the 2A didn't spend a lot of time there, the 1 and R doesn't really have that much arguments to answer the line by line. So they're just reading blocks, which often sound generic. If the 1 and R basically can't get really in depth and do analysis of like the actual affirmative, then in my opinion, this 2 and R that extends to 1 and R is just dead in the water because the affirmative in the 2AR will always be able to recontextualize cross-apply case and sort of tell the story of the cap K way better than the affirmative can, since they're spending like months, they're spending a lot of time reading about the AF and reading about how it interacts with like capitalism. So they'll be able to sort of lie and cross-apply in the 2AR in a way that like the 2 and R just won't be able to recover from. The second 2 and R that goes for cap is the one that just wanted to go for cap since the 1AC. So the 2NC is 8 minutes of cap. The 1 and R probably took a few minutes of stuff that they didn't pick up on, or it's like case and presumption, or maybe it's framework. The problem with these 2 and Rs, in my opinion, is that it's kind of predictable. Like if you can tell that the 2 and R wants to be cap, you can probably tell because there are like 6 cap cards in the 1 and C, right? If I were the 2A, I'd probably spend like 2 minutes on case, 2 minutes on framework, and 4 minutes on cap, which would make the 2 and C really, really hard since they want to read that big overview. They want to read their big perm block. They want to read the alt extension, but they also have to answer 4 minutes of new arguments on the line by line, some of which are going to be specific to the 1AC that they haven't prepared, they haven't seen before because KFs, really proliferate their own specific arguments. And the 1AR can also sort of make the cap K really hard to go for if they cover it properly with time, just because there are going to be so many doors that the 2 and R has to shut, and they have to answer case because you can cross apply case in the 2AR if they don't go there and sort of like make the debate really hard for the neg. And like all in all, I think that if you're gonna go for cap, you should still use the second strategy just because you can sort of out debate the affirmative by the 2 and C, and then if the 1 and R is framework, it can actually make the 1AR super hard. But I still think that the app should win most cap K debates. The reason that is number three, which is that your app should always already be built to defeat the cap K. Either it link turns the K or it impact turns the alt. For example, Afro pessimism originally it originated as a critique of Marxism, a sort of critique of like Gramscian like ideas of like who gets to speak, who gets to change civil society, like who's forming these coalitions. Like if you're gonna read a K that's like sort of focus on arguments about why collisions fail, about why we shouldn't be engaging in reform, it probably defeats the cap K. So you should be prepared to like, read the best cards on why like anti-capitalist movements fail, why they're racist, why like they sort of collapse back into capitalism. If you're not gonna like read a K that's like really sort of pessimistic or takes a hardline approach, then you probably link turn or root cause the K really well. For example, the abolition the abolition act last year, like endorsed grassroots movements that like caused massive revolutionary changes across the country, that shut down like massive like profit producing complexes like the PIC. Like none of the infrapolitics links, like none of the sort of like the like racial focus links, none of those really link to the F, which allows it to link turn the CapK really well. Like if you're gonna read a sort of more niche F, like Asian identity, logistics, different Moten arguments, you probably have a really good root cause claim to cap. Like you probably have a way of explaining capitalism better than the neg will be able to do, since the neg has to take an approach that's like only a class-based focus is key. Like we shouldn't be concerned by secondary questions of race before first asking like primary based questions of like what is the sort of broader system that oppresses all of us. And I feel like on a truth level, you should be able to beat those claims by explaining how like capitalism is always racially motivated, about how like certain differences in the theory, certain examples they can't explain justifies a perm, it justifies a link turn, which sort of makes it really easy for you to either beat cap by saying like, oh, like the alternative is bad, or we are the alternative, which is why you should like vote on the perm. So I'm just gonna really quickly go over some of the 1ACs I've cut and the ways that I engage in those practices before opening myself up to questions from our two people in this Zoom right now. So I'm gonna start from my sophomore year. I'm just gonna do some quick don'ts. Do not read 2 cards on the theory of power in 7 minutes of framework preamps. So this was a anarchism militarism app that I stole from the Michigan K no, it wasn't from K-Lab, but it was from Michigan. It was a camp file. And I took the first 2 cards that were the theory of power. And then I read 1, 2, 3, like 10 cards on framework preamps. The reason why this isn't strategic is because A, it looks really bad to the judge because it looks like you're just reading this app for strategic purposes. And B, it leaves you really vulnerable to arguments that like aren't necessarily framework. For example, the cap K, although this app should probably be the cap K, but it left me like really vulnerable to, for example, Afropes, left me vulnerable to the university K. Also, like, it just wasn't that strategic since a lot of these cards make the same argument, which was just like debate should be sort of used to produce different ethical perspectives. We shouldn't talk about the state in every instance, but this leaves you vulnerable to like counter plans or disads. I see the chat. My docs aren't showing. Okay, that sucks. Let me stop sharing.
I believe you have to reshare based on your screen,
Yeah.
not your window.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So really quickly, I was just saying, don't do like this first half, which was just 2 cards on the theory of power and like 10 cards on like just preempts the framework, because it's not actually that strategic. So yeah. The second half I cut was a Derrida half, and I'm just gonna go ahead and say, don't ever read something just because your varsity told you to. Don't read something you don't understand. Don't read something you don't really believe is true. Like it will not be good. Like you will lose a lot of rounds. Like you're not gonna have fun while debating. But yeah, that's actually what I did for the first semester of sophomore year. I read this Derrida half. I had no idea what I was saying. As a result, I found it really difficult to sort of explain like the AF in cross sects. I found it difficult to impact it out during like debates over framework. I had no idea how to weigh like the iterative production of statecraft and ghosts versus procedural fairness. Like I literally had no idea what to say. I would advise you, like, if you want to read Derrida, this is not a critique. I'm not saying that like Derrida is bad. I'm saying that like you should really sort of try to understand the literature base. You should care about what you're saying and like get really deep. Be excited to debate Derrida, because if you don't necessarily believe or understand the arguments, you're gonna get put into positions where like the one in C is really, really good. Like it's gonna require you to understand the AF, like not just on a theory level, but on a strategic level. Like why is there the strategic is a question I was never able to answer. Like why would I want to be endorsing a method of spectrography, which is a term I made up sophomore year, like in this debate, like if I hit a K like Afropess, if I hit a K like university. For example, this AF was really good against the university K because it pretty much didn't do anything and just said like, yeah, status quo debates are bad. We should like become otherwise. So this one round at Glenbrooks, we hit this Bronx Science team. It was their A team. They were really good, and we actually beat them because they went for the university K, and we were just like, LOL. That's like we're like the one AF that your K thinks is a good idea. But the next round we hit Meadows and Y, and they smashed us on the Cap K, since like they asked us those hard questions like, what does the AF do? Why should we only do the AF? Like, why is like a Marxist revolution, material reform bad? Like, we just couldn't answer that question. So I would like advise you to not just read something because you think it's strategic or you think it's cool, but you should really care about what you're reading. So this is the third AF I ever read, which was a Asian identity AF about militarism called Soldiering. And this is where I started to find more success because I was debating something I was passionate about, I was genuinely interested in. And as a result, I started to sort of cut cards myself that like I understood better because I was cutting the cards. I just want to go ahead and say that you should maybe not cut the method card for your AF the night before the tournament. This is what happened at Barkley for me. And we hit McQueen round one, which was like a really good team that year. And the judge was like, I almost voted for y'all, but I didn't understand what the AF did. And because I cut the method the day before the tournament, I like I understand I couldn't explain what the AF exactly did. So with that being said, I did cut this method the day before the tournament, and I actually read it for the rest of the year, and I actually won quite a few rounds. But it was important for me to sort of understand the book, the literature I was reading, and the ways to explain it strategically. That sort of allowed me to win rounds. During this time, sophomore year, I also cut a few framing tricks on framework that I would recommend you sort of look into. I farmed the wiki from a college team that read Asian Identity, and I sort of read this card about Asian American rhetoric, and then I thought about how could this be strategic against framework, and then I realized, oh, maybe we can use this as like a debate key warrant. And like once you find a debate key warrant, you find a reason for why the affirmative is important, for why you should like the discussion of the affirmative is not something that's just like it's not just good, it's necessary. It's something that we have to have that can make framework really, really strategic for you, like in terms of beating framework. Because it's like if they can't win a TVA, then like they can't really win that your AF is included under their topic. And if you win that the AF is important, then like that topic is probably bad. Even if they win switch side debate, 50% of debates on their model, like you are forced to just not talk about the affirmative ever since they didn't win a TVA, which is probably a bad model of debate that also forces you to switch sides on like issues that we shouldn't be switching sides on, which like makes it really easy for you to win offense if you can win a debate key warrant. And I found that like from a purely arbitrary measure, judges probably lean slightly AF if it's 100% risk of neg offense versus 100% of AF offense, just because perceptually it's hard for a judge to be like, yes, I grant the AF full weight that the neg has been racist, that their model causes exclusion of minority debaters, that's like literally violent, but procedural fairness is sounding like pretty nice, pretty appetizing today. So if you can win 100% risk of AF offense or get really close to it each round, you're going to be in a really good spot in terms of like the framework debates you're having. But the first thing, like in order to do that, is that you need that a debate key warrant. You need a warrant for what debate should look like. You need a warrant for why your discussion is valuable and important. Yeah, these cards were sort of just like an extension of that. So this is the first full AF I cut, which was junior year. And the research process I did for this was sort of I knew that I wanted to have an affirmative about Asian identity by this point, and I knew that the topic was criminal justice. So I used a few different search terms like Asian identity, criminal justice reform, but also like sort of Asian approaches to criminal justice, like Asian violence and criminal, like Asian criminality, etc. And I found a good topic link that was about this sort of Wayne Low case in 2000, which sort of just explained how Asian people are dehumanized by the criminal justice system. And then the COVID-19 pandemic unfortunately granted a lot of uniqueness to these claims. This was actually cut by my coach who was supposed to give this lecture today. And then I stole this card. And then I cut a lot of these other cards from a random article I found from this author named Johnson. This was a really powerful article for me since it just like gave me a lot of claims to sort of base my theory around what I wanted the app to look like. And I also reused a few framing cards from the app I cut sophomore year just because I thought those the big keywords are really strategic. So this was like my approach. And if you remember like the different approaches we had to cutting chaos, this was the first approach, right? So I found the theory that I wanted to read, and then I sort of found how the theory interacted with the topic, and then I cut cards like from those intersections, and it ended up being strategic, even though I didn't cut from the 2AC first. Um, this is the second half I read on the CGR topic, which was just that settler colonialism half I was talking about. This half I did cut from the 2AC forward. So I like obviously knew that like there would be a lot of set call and CJR cards that were out there. So I instead started from this sort of refusal framing, which is to me, I thought it was strategic because there is just no TVA that can solve a half that says like we should not do CJR. Like what type of like, I don't know. But like because it just instinctively beats the TVA, you can win a really high risk of offense, right? There's no TVA, there's probably no switch side debate. If you just say like we should never have debates over CJR, that means that the neg is probably going to win a lot of offense too, since the AF is like not trying to be topical, which then meant that like this AF was sort of built to either impact turn fairness and internal link turn clash really hard by using a strategy that was just like our model is actually more limited than their model in the 2AR because it only allows debates over a certain subject, which produces more clash over things that are valuable instead of like useless debates over the process counterplan. And then this half was also cut from the 2AC forward. I cut this half to beat K teams. We actually lost the one round. We read it at the TOC, but I thought it was still pretty strategic because it took a far more left approach in terms of debate critical arguments than the first Asian identity app I read on the topic. And this is a useful lesson just for sort of like, if you're going to cut a new app, it doesn't have to necessarily be an entirely new literature base. For example, Nobro cut like 13 apps their senior year, and about like 7 of them were like obviously about anti-blackness, but those 7 apps are so different and serve different strategic purposes that they were like completely new apps. Like although they did have like some tangential like similarities in terms of like maybe the topic link they used was the same. Maybe some of the framework cards they read in the 2AC were the same, but they still had different sort of operations, different strategic purposes that allowed them to really just win a lot of rounds on apps that were completely new, that were like really strategic and tricky. So yeah, that's my lecture over the critical affirmative, how to write one, and sort of the strategy that you can gain from it. Are there any questions really quick? Or-
Yeah. So you said you write like a lot of apps, or you did write a lot of apps. So two AC blocks take like a long time. How do you construct two AC blocks for multiple different apps?
I
Very
feel you. Yeah. So that's a great question. So I actually cut, let me see. For the CJR topic, I finished 1, 2, 3. I finished 4 apps in entirety, which actually isn't that many. I only ended up breaking 3 apps that entire season. And the way that I approached block writing is that I usually use that second strategy, which was the write the 2AC framework block first, right? So it's actually really hard to write framework blocks, in my opinion, if you start from like just completely from the 1AC, because you'll like you said, it's time consuming. You have to read every card, figure out why it's strategic, and then you have to make arguments from there. But if I go into the AF writing process with my 2AC blocks already done per se, because I know like what's strategic, like I want to read this really strategic argument, then it's actually kind of easier to write blocks. For example, like if you're gonna hit like fairness like every round this year, right? You really want to after just as like fuck fairness. I do not care about fairness. Like it's dumb. If you make those arguments first, then you find cards that support that can sort of speed up the block writing process. Also, Joe, who I think is in here, can tell you about how he went into multiple tournaments this year with a AF that has a cap K AT, a framework AT, and then like no other blocks, I think, to any other arguments. And like he got 4 bids. He got 3rd seed at the TOC and like he won a ton of rounds. Like most teams are really bad at innovating against KFs, not even just new KFs, just like AFs in general. Like they just want to read cap and framework. So if you can get blocks to those two, like you're probably like 80% done with KF prep. But do you have like a more specific question in terms of prep or?
Yeah, specifically for framework.
Okay, for framework?
Yeah.
Alright,
So is there a, so I guess like 2 questions. One, is there like a general interpretation that KFs use for framework, like one ontology first, or like, or is it specifically individual to every single KF?
so I would say like, I would say a lot of KFs have similar interpretations that same to serve purpose, but they're still like distinct, but you can usually tell which apps are gonna have like what types of interpretations, right? So a lot of apps, for example, they want to take a hardline approach to frameworks. So they don't really want to read like counter definitions. They don't really want to go for proceed like we solve limits, we solve ground. They want to have a counter interp that solves their offense. So that counter interp would look like interp. We should have a sociogenic reading of the resolution. We should have a settler colonial reading of the resolution. The app should adopt a militant reading of the resolution. Like the app should like analyze the logistical underpinnings of the revolution. These sound really similar, right? They all serve the same purpose. It's just to say that our model of debate would have like a sufficient number of debates over X theory that we have said is really important. Like this isn't the most limited. It's not limited at all. We're gonna pretend like it's kind of limited, but it's like it creates KVK debates, which are good. It creates like productive debates over shit that matters, not the process counter plan. So that's like one counter term, right? If you're gonna read an AF that's like really critical, you might want to use that one. But let's say you want to read an AF that's like less critical, it's less hardline. Let's say you think that water protection is good, but you think that the USFG is bad. Well, then you might read an interp that's like counter interp. Like grassroots movements doing water protection is topical, or you might define USFG as grassroots movements as we the people. So this counter interp, it's much less hardline. It probably gives you some defense to fairness, the limits and crown, but it probably like it's not suitable for every affirmative, but it's suitable to AFs that are like more material and less like hardline, if that makes sense.
Right. So could util, one, I guess there's 2 questions. One, could util be under framework? And 2, could just like, 8 minutes of util, just like, could like the whole framework debate be like util versus whatever their framework is?
So I think you're talking a bit some more like framing or like neg framework kind of like the way or like framework as in like if I was reading a K on the neg against the AF and like you were making arguments about like impacts, the way that like framework operates in like debates against planless AFs is actually really similar to topicality. So the teams are usually making arguments about why the AF was like not topical, unpredictable, and thus like is unfair to debate against or like shouldn't be debated against in interest of like preserving like limits or like neg ground. So you usually don't see arguments about like util in terms of like framework debates. Sometimes teams will read a disad against your KF. Like a lot of teams like reading the hedge disad, which I think is like kind of racist, but um then util matters. In those debates, though, it's actually a really simple util debate. Because the planless app just needs to be like, it's really messed up and racist for like a team to be like nuclear war outweighs like this thing we've literally said like predates that. Like, I don't know. Like, does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So like, but I guess the question would be like, because like you, the distinction would be like framing goes on a separate page, probably not for KVK debates. But like, if util is true, that means your like framework doesn't matter. Only like material actions matter, or should
Oh,
that be the competing framework, right?
okay. I guess I see what you're saying. Like, I think util is sort of distinct from like material framing because util is just an argument about like we should maximize the amount of good or like we should maximize amount of good to most individuals, which necessitates like not prioritizing the lives of a few over like the health of like the many, right? It's like the sort of greater good argument. But I think I know what you're talking about. Like a lot of framework teams like do make arguments that are like the app should endorse something material. They should like forward a specific reform or a policy or uh, a sort of a way for their activism to get actualized. And that is like an argument that like teams sort of make. So is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, but like
A-
it. So yeah, that's kind of right.
And you wanted to like know how to answer that, right?
Yeah, how would you answer that?
Yeah. So the ways that like this usually gets used in debates on like chaos is on like the presumption argument, honestly, which is just like vote neg because the app hasn't done anything. And the ways that I approach answering that is like A, having a justification for why doing nothing is, or not doing nothing, but like A, having a justification for why not being material is okay, why it's good. The way I approached this last year was like that debate key warrant, that framing trick I had was like strategic for me because if I have a warrant for why like debate specifically is necessary for doing some good thing, then it shouldn't matter what we have to do materially because we're doing something good in debate. We're doing something good rhetorically. We're doing something good agentially. We're doing something good performatively, right? The second thing is to have an argument that's just like, yeah, we are material. Like it's not true, but I mean like USFG does X policy is also not true. So it's just like have a claim that's like we spill up the material action through endorsing X movement. We learn about movements and we export our portable skills and debate knowledge to the real world. Examples like leaders of a beautiful struggle prove. There was another example that these logistics teams and abolition teams used last year that I'm forgetting, like Operation Montreal or something. I can get back to you on that. But like there are different examples of how debaters have done good things in the real world. And those can like sort of be useful sometimes by uh, like in terms of proving how the app becomes material.
Okay, and I guess this is I don't know if this is a good question, but one, can you run condo if you're doing a calf? And has any team gone for a condo in the 2AR when they're a calf?
That is an excellent question. So neg teams usually think that you get infinite condo when debating against a KF because they have foreclosed like their claims, the competition, they foreclose claims of fairness, right? Like how can you go for like condo to AC makes it impossible to be F like when you've not defended the resolution. I think that planless 2A should be able to go for conditionality. I think that neg condo abuse is ridiculous. I think that critical approaches to condo, not in terms of like those terrible critical skills arguments, like, oh my God, those are so bad. But if you make a good argument about like how condo is like, let's say you're reading a set call app, right? And the other team is two settlers and they're like read a counter plans about like how we should help like native folk and then they kick all of them. Like I would find like a framing of how like that replicates the logic of like breaking treaties, like the Fort Laramie Treaty, like 380 treaties, like kind of persuasive. Like if you're gonna critique like the neg's reliance on fairness, you can also critique their reliance on like conditionality as like a bad debate practice that like reproduces like logics that you have said are ingrained in debate. In terms of teams that have gone for condo with the planless app, my first round ever sophomore year was against Lexington BY, where they read 3 Ks in framework. And the 2AR was condo. It was the conditionality bad argument. And I lost that round. And I got a 28-4, I think. I think Lexington got a 29-6. So I wouldn't say it's very strategic, because like the framing that's just like you cheated first is like really persuasive to judges. It's like you didn't read an aff that defends a plan, therefore we get to cheat in response to your cheating. Is like pretty persuasive to most judges. But
Okay. And I think this is kind of like a next question, but I assume you can answer it.
yeah.
How could you impact turn a KF? Or is that just like impossible?
Ooh, there are some things you can impact turn and some things you can't. All right.
Well,
I
for
Wait, no. Yeah, I'll answer that question. Like specifically with KFs, like straight out, do not impact turn any claim that says that like X thing is like racism, right? Never say anti-blackness good, never say model minority good, never say settler colonialism good, unless although settler colonialism good, teams have been saying it through the hedge dissent. So this is what most teams will impact turn KFs with nowadays. Like you'll read a card that says like maybe the state is bad, USFG is bad, militarism bad, and they'll take it as a license to say no, like US primacy good, like the government, the military is good. We sort of shouldn't be so pessimistic because it allows countries like China or Russia to fill in, which would be infinitely worse. It would also cause extinction through nuclear war. That's one way to impact turn chaos. You can also sort of turn the idea that like state engagement is bad, right? And you can do that like instead of just reading like Zanati 14 or like the Choate card, you could read your AF as a counter plan, which I've never actually seen win a debate before. You could Something I heard a judge tell me this year was that if the AF says that water pollution is bad and warming is bad, then the neg could theoretically read warming good and like iron fertilization and water good, and like that'd be competitive. So those are like a few ways to impact turn a KF.
Wait, so that brings up some more questions, but what do you mean when you say read the app as a counterpart?
So like let's say you have what was like the AF you read last year, for example.
Just the policy app, just like
Yeah, no, I was wondering like what is the policy AF you're reading?
divest from the police.
Exactly. Perfect. That's a great example. So like if I'm a KF and I'm reading an argument that just says like all criminal justice reform ever is just completely terrible and racist, there's no example of a good criminal justice reform, then you can read your divest from policing AF as a counterplan that says this is an impact turn to the claim that all CJR is bad. If we prove this one CJR is good, it disproves the AF's theory, it's competitive, and it's like a reason to vote neg because like we have fundamentally disproved that the AF is true, right?
Oh, okay. Right.
I will keep in mind that this has not won a round before, as far as I think. The reason is actually the neg's fault. The 2AC gives like some half-assed answer that's like perm do both, like doesn't solve the AF. Like our AF explains your theory with like explains our AF explains the counter plan without reading any cards. And then it's just like if the neg like really wanted to go for this, like 8 minutes in the 2NC, like they would probably win that debate. But I've never seen a team do it. So I mean maybe you can be the first one.
True. And the second thing is like, how does like how does a KF link to hedge DA? Because like hedge has to deal with like arm cells or whatever, or like it was mainly using the arms race topic because it's like, oh, hegemonic powers of the US or whatever. Just like powers the US can exert over other countries. But like, how does that apply to like a soft leaning KF?
That's a great question. I'm gonna go ahead and like my hot take is that like if you read like hedge against like the Afro pest, I'm not sure. Okay, so like the way that Joe explained it to me is like the link is less premised off like the idea of like a literal link, right? It's not like the AF causes like like Biden to like fall out of his chair like dead one day, but it's like the arguments you're endorsing take like this incredibly critical approach to the state, to the USFG, to the conception that like any US action could be good. And like that's a bad frame to use because like the US can be good. Specifically, it can be good in terms of keeping hegemony, in terms of keeping primacy, keeping China and Russia at bay. And like that loss of faith in our institutions and our military and our abilities to like be number one is what emboldens countries like China and Russia to like go crazy, to nuke us, to like institute even more repressive regimes, to like cause extinction, etc. There is one example, like I honestly still don't think that link is very strong. I think there are ways for the AF to like either make the neg say something that like in round rhetoric wise, like probably double turns like the hedge they said, just because like the alternative is like them saying something super racist and like losing on a D roll. The one time I had a debate at NBA and Octas where I lost against the hedge decide while reading the sec call F, right? And the way they explained it was just like settler colonialism says like the US is fundamentally like this the terrible POS like country. And like all of the authors of the 1AC would probably agree that a world without the USFG is good. Like the AF probably agrees that the world without the USFG would be good. We are saying that a world without the USFG would be bad. Like therefore you link. Like we are impact turning like any conception you have.
Right. So basically, are you saying that hedge DA is just like state good?
It's like US good. Like if that it's like more often. Wait, go ahead, Joe.
My opinion is it's just like the AF creates political subjects that are oriented away towards US primacy, which is bad. So it's sort of that the US as a state is good, but also just like the link is generally like patriotism is good, and the AF does not create political subjects oriented towards patriotism.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Okay.
I feel like that's like not a great like I'm not saying like your explanation of it is bad. I'm just saying like to me on like a truth level, it's like sussy. Like if you read a TVA and a 2NC, like you probably link. Like and if it's like also like an in-round rhetoric thing about like the subjectivities we produce, then it's like I don't know. But
Yeah, generally the link argument is the problem with that link argument is that there's too many thumpers, which is
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
mostly true.
Okay. And then what was I gonna say? And then does that argument still link to things that like don't necessarily make a claim about the state? Like, well, what you said, like Afro president. Well, you kind of said it does link. Like,
My take is that like the AF should win that debate. Like if both sides debate it equally. I had a lot of rounds on this last year where teams would read hedge against my Asian identity AF, which is like kind of racist, but like
yeah,
the way like the first few rounds we had on it, like they were kind of messy rounds, like because we didn't stumble upon the right arguments to make to like sort of expose why that logic is wrong, but we figured out how to start doing it the second half of the year, where we'll just ask like a ton of those thumper questions, right? And like they're really uncomfortable questions that are like if they answer like any of them, like if they go all in on like no, like Iraq, that was good, Afghanistan, good, Vietnam, good. Like you can probably win on a D roll, to be honest. Like even if George W. Bush and Reagan disagree with the neg, then like they're kind of racist. Like if they answer like differently, then they probably link to like these unpatriotic, anti-hegemonic discourses and rhetorics. So that was like the way that I would get out of it if I was gonna read it after like Afropest or like Asian identity, which doesn't really link, but they're gonna go for like this rhetoric link.
So I'm still confused on how like pessimism makes people anti-patriotic. Like how, because like
Okay, I mean, go ahead, Joe. Wait, yeah.
Well, so I think you're getting a little too fixated on this, but my opinion is just like the reason that this link argument applies to that AF is just that like it makes us pessimistic about political action. Patriotism says everything about civil society bad. But the problem with that is that literally every other AF says that, literally every other political theorist says that, which runs into the thumper problem we said before. And also probably the link probably does suck. So there's that as well.
okay,
Also, like it just does. I mean, like you know, like Back to Blue, right? Like all of those like terrible Blue Lives Matter things.
yeah,
Like
huge.
that's like distinctly patriotic, and obviously, like every Afropest author ever would be like, oh, like that. That's terrible. Like every person nowadays in debate probably thinks that too. But
Well, isn't that the same with like everything? It's like because my coaches just tell me just like impact or like not my coaches, but like the people who help me just like impact turn whatever they say. Like if they say cap good, cap bad, or like if they say cap bad, cap good, and like of course if you're in debate or if you cite any authors at all, they will probably say like capitalism is generally bad, but like I feel like that's the same way with the hedge DA, which is just
yeah, like you can just impact turn and go hedge bad. Like it depends on the app you're reading. If you're gonna read like a militarism app, yeah, you have to do that. My problem with that is just like it's really time consuming. Like the neg can spend 2 minutes on it, and if you have to spend 2 minutes or 3 minutes in the 2AC answering it and case and like the framework page, you're not in a great spot. So like I personally think you should work on some really strategic no link dumper this that is stupid arguments, but still have like a hedge bad file in case like they go all in on it. So you like you can be you're ready to answer.
okay.
Also, Joe, what is your take on if they read the neolib or capk in a 1 and C, they double turn the hedge this ad rhetoric request?
I think yes, because they're opposed to the status quo world order of US hegemony. So
But yeah, for sure. Like now that I think about, yeah, a Marxist revolution is
Yeah, I-
100% anti-hegemonic.
like even if they build a new communist state, seems like definitely opposed to squo primacy.
Or it solves no AF offense, because yeah, okay, yeah.
If they
All
read
right.
hedge and cap, the decide is terminally thumped. Like they thumped it themselves.
How do you feel about the privatization counterplan to set call K in the same 1 and C?
It seems as though you've privatized native land.
What if native people privatize from the USFG? Ayo. But yeah, okay. Do you have any other question?
No.
Okay. This was a very